and I'm putting the aggression solidly on the heads and hands of the Romans. But this first aggression gave Europe the means of feeding itself and to expand for the first time beyond its shores and sustain itself.
Was profit the motive for slavery?
Profit was the motive for slavery and a form of colonialism. Now, profit and bread. See, capitalism in the present sense didn't exist then, although the profit motive was a part of man's psychological makeup. But the justification for the Romans being was that they were endowed by certain traits, in spite of the fact that once they destroyed Carthage, they could not even build it back the same way because they didn't have those master architects that the Carthaginians had. Now, Rome would sustain itself in this part of the world, and Roman taxation ultimately would force the Africans and the Asians to question old gods and look for new gods. This questioning, this wondering whether their gods had deserted them would make them look into their folklore, their literature, and bring forth the beginnings, the formal beginnings of a religion that we might later know as Christianity. Not that the religion was new, but that particular formation of the ideas of the religion was new.
All right, let's pause here, Professor Clark, and we'll continue with the African presence in the so-called New World right after this. As far as the African presence in this hemisphere, was that premise for coming here economic or what? Curiosity or what?
The initial movement here was an accident.
How'd that happen?
This happened, first of all, I must give a dating schema because there was not just a single visit. There were several, at least half a dozen visits for which we have evidence. The very earliest is one that involves the people known as the Olmec in America, between 948 and 680 BC. We do know a date because they found a ceremonial platform, a wooden platform in the Gulf of Mexico where the Americans worshipped. They were able to carbon date it. They found 4 of a dozen stone heads with African features rooted in the wood of this carbon dated platform, and they were able to give it a dating of 814 plus or minus 134 BC. Now that is a very interesting date indeed, because that is a time when something very unusual was happening in the old world in Africa. A war was going on, both a hot and cold war, which lasted a very long time between the powers of Asia under the Assyrians and the Egypto-Nubians. I say Egypto-Nubian because Nubia and Egypt were linked in that period, very strongly linked in fact, because the Nubians had, from about the 22nd dynasty, they were involved with Libyan powers in Middle Egypt, and then they moved up and took control of Egypt from the Mediterranean right down to Khartoum and beyond. And in this period, the military and commercial navies were moving west of the Mediterranean towards the Atlantic. They normally were not involved in the Atlantic. The Egyptian navies and the Phoenicians, who were very much involved with Egyptians, carried a lot of trade into the Pacific. We even have Egyptian hieroglyphs found in early Hawaii. But in this period, the Asiatic routes, sea routes, were blocked by the Asiatics. Yes. They blocked off the Egyptian sea routes. As a consequence, a great deal of the metal trade, the search for...
But how would you get from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, though?
No, they had the Red Sea and other routes, and they went into the Indian Ocean and various things.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so they had trading, Egypt had trading in other parts of the world, but in this particular period, while they had trade in the Western Mediterranean, this particular period became tremendously intensified. We even have evidence around 800 BC of Phoenician ships up in near the British Isles. They're trading in tin. Tin was critical to Egypt because that was the Bronze Age, and tin and copper were critical to the making of bronze, and you have a lot of movement in that area west of the Mediterranean. Now, there seems to have been an accident involving at least 7 ships. The Native Americans record black-skinned people coming in 7 wooden caves on the water from the east. And they do record this, and lots of people are not aware of it.
You mean they got lost at sea, or?
They got lost at sea. All so-called discoveries of America were initially accidents. Columbus had no intention of coming here. He got lost at sea. He was going towards India, as he thought. He struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India. Even in the case of 1500, where Alvarez Cabral came to South America, he had no intention of coming here. He was lost at sea.
Is it not true, though, that Africans, in their mathematical endeavors, concluded that the world was round and that there was land beyond the horizon, and that it was not an accident that they came to this hemisphere?
They concluded that the world was round. Just as much later, Columbus concluded that the world was round. But knowing that
so doesn't that imply then that...
No, it does not.
No?
It does not. Knowing that the world is round does not imply a landmass here. That is the reason why Columbus, when he landed here, thought he was in Asia. Because you would not know where the landmass is. This could have been Asia. That's why, in fact, it was called India. It wasn't called America.
But just to pin you a little bit down to this, was the African lost at sea, the African mariner lost at sea and was blown across the Atlantic?
Yes.
Or did he or she set out deliberately?
No, he did not set out deliberately in this voyage. There are voyages in which the Africans set out deliberately to come to America. We know of 2 such voyages. We know, for example, in the case of the Mandingo in 1310 and 1311, where the Africans were convinced there was a landmass in the south and set out deliberately. A whole fleet was fitted out for that. And when that fleet did not return, one of their kings, Abubakar II, actually set out as a commander of the fleet and moved into this area. We also have evidence in the late pre-Columbian, that is around 1450 AD, we have evidence where Africans not only deliberately came, but came back. And we have African things found in America as well as American things found in Africa as evidence of a trading going on in that time.
What was the nature of the African contact with the people who were indigenous to the land here?
Well, it depends on the period. In the case of the Olmec period, which is the pre-Christian period, which is the 948 to 680 BC, we have evidence that some very extraordinary things begin to happen that coincide with the stone heads with African features, which are found in the Gulf of Mexico at the terminus of currents coming from Africa. Now, one very important thing to understand is that there are 3 major currents that take things from Africa. They are so powerful, these currents, that it's like a gravitational field.
The oceanic current.
You cannot escape coming to America once you are caught 100 miles off the African coast and enter either the current off the Cape Verde, off the Senegambia coast, or off the southern coast of Africa. You have to come here, unless you're caught by the fish. It's inevitable. And in fact, I do remember when I was a boy, when I was about 11 years old, I lived most of my early boyhood was spent on a river, the Essequibo River, which opens out onto the Atlantic. And
Where is that? What country is
this
that?
is in South America, Guyana.
Yes.
I was caught in one of the currents that the Africans call a river in the middle of the sea. It's quite different from normal currents. If you're caught in a normal current, you could dive beneath the current. But in this current, it is like a whole new river pulling you out of the river. And I screamed my head off because I was 7 miles from coast. I'd fallen asleep on a raft. I spent lots of times in the rivers. And nobody could hear me because I was too far until the current, which was taking me into the Atlantic, came across a place called Keough Island. And that was close to shore as the current moved off.
You were on your way home.
Yes.
Or back home.
Well, the fish would have got me in this particular case,
well, one never knows.
But I was picked up by speedboats. But this has happened several times from Africa. We found several things in the American world that are African. I want specifically to touch on the Olmec, because there they have
presence
found
peaceful here in this hemisphere?
Yes, with the exception, we have one instance where we have battles between the Africans and the Americans off Clark-pt.10. where they found that the Africans were fighting. They had a settlement and they were fighting with Native Americans.